Hi, and welcome to Living and Learning. Today, our topic is going to be the adolescent mind. And we're going to get a little bit deeper than just the adolescent mind in this. We're going to talk about a specific aspect of it, and that is how addiction would affect the adolescent mind. My name is Karen Kugel, and I'm your host, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Jon Cohan, who has done a number of things in the field of mental health, very distinguished career, I would actually say, in this area, and very proud to say that he is actually a practitioner in our town, Concord, Massachusetts, in the area of individual and family addiction treatment programs. He also serves on the board of directors for the Middlesex or the regional aspect of the National Alliance for Mental Illness as well. And he has a couple of other things that I think he'll probably bring up in the course of our discussion. But let's just get right to it. Let's talk a little bit, Jon, and thank you so much for being here with us today as our expert.
Thanks for having me here, Karen.
Great,
Appreciate
great.
it.
You're welcome. And let's just talk about the adolescent mind and why it is so important for us to distinguish it from other areas of development of the brain.
Well, most importantly, I think the adolescent brain is an amazing organ. It really is this fueled engine that is running probably better than it ever will in our lifetime. So during adolescence, it is growing and making connections. It learns quicker than it ever will. It's discarding stuff it doesn't need very quickly, and it learns probably quicker than you and I will after.
So sad.
I know. Well, we learn differently as we get older, which is the good news. So that's the really good news. The bad news is that learning can have a double edge to it, because if we think of addiction as basically a system of reward in the brain, right? If I take a shot of whiskey right now, if I'm an adolescent and I do a shot of whiskey, that sense of well-being and euphoria spreads quickly, and there is a reward that happens in my brain, and my brain remembers that. And as an adolescent, that bond, that neural pathway that's built in that learning becomes really strong. So to break that bond is really, really difficult. The good news, again, on the other side of that, is if it can be learned, it can often be unlearned. But adolescents are at a higher risk of developing addiction quicker because of that very strong learning connection in the brain.
I see. Are there any differences between, if we talk about teenagers, right?
Yeah.
Is this a global thing? And are there any gender differences in that?
So what the deficit or the difference between an adult brain and a teenage brain is that there are some gender differences, but basically the big issue is that the frontal part of the brain is still being formed. Mm-hmm. You and I have fully developed, hopefully, the prefrontal cortex and the frontal part of our brain. In adolescence, they don't. That's still developing. Why is that important to our conversation? It's important because the prefrontal cortex and that frontal part of the brain are involved in risk assessment, are involved in governing, impulsivity, and they're involved in, judgment about situations, executive functioning. So the lack of that there is actually a great evolutionary benefit to humans, because 600 years ago, 13-year-olds were expected to leave the nest and go out and start their own families and start, raising children and perpetuating the species. And that lack of kind of risk assessment was a really helpful thing out, 600 years ago. So that exists, and again, the reason, if all we have to do is think of the average teenager who goes out and might do some kind of crazy things. You can look on Facebook and see, kids dangling off of a 100-story building and then, not breaking a sweat. And that is that lack, it's the impulsivity piece that's being driven by the amygdala, the kind of the central part of the brain, and the lack of judgment and risk assessment that happens in the to be yet formed prefrontal part.
So give me a time frame then. We're talking about the adolescent brain. What ages are we really speaking of? I've read some things about, the brain being, I don't want to say completely formed, but the most important part of it, maybe by 25.
25,
and then maybe a little bit.
27.
Can you talk about that?
I mean, I'm not a neurologist
neuroscientist,
or
yeah.
neuroscientist, so you need to.
That's okay.
I'm coming at it from the addiction point, but from what I understand is that, to our best knowledge, when a baby is born, even before the birth, the brain is growing at exponential rates, and by the time adolescence begins in early adolescence, so the preteen kind of 10, 11, 12, and then adolescence, the brain is growing and developing. And it goes to about 25, 26, 27. There's no hard number as far, it doesn't see your 26th birthday and stop. Again, this is important for our conversation because the deal is that if I introduce a foreign substance, a substance of addiction into the formative years of an adolescent brain, it's going to change things. It's going to have a bigger impact than it might on somebody whose brain is fully formed.
I see. So tell me about the changes and how they occur.
As far as addiction goes?
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, there's, the way we best kind of can contextualize addiction now is by, I like to think of it as what they call the biopsychosocial model of addiction. So that stands for biological, psychological, and social. And the biological, psychological, social aspects are, the biological piece is there somebody in my family tree who has had an addictive disorder, substance use disorder, alcohol, anything else? Is there somebody in my family tree that has, difficulties with mental health stuff, things like that? So that can up my chances for developing an addiction about 50%. It doesn't mean if I have that marker, I'm doomed. It just means that all things being equal, I'm going to, have a higher chance of than the person that doesn't have that. So how into an adolescent brain I bring in, let's say, the first, often we're seeing a lot of people introduced to opiates, and sometimes very legitimately, somebody gets a sports injury, they go to the doctor prescribes, Percocet, let's say, which is oxycodone. And 9 out of 10 adolescents will take that, and they'll use it exactly how it was meant to be used. And approximately 10% of the population can use that addictively. So what happens is that changes, that reward happens, and it's the skies open up. This is the greatest change, the greatest feeling somebody's ever experienced. And again, that's a really profound learning experience. Imagine if you're somebody who is depressed, anxious, attention deficit, has executive functioning, or just feels removed from, social things. And what's more important to a teenager than the social world? So that changes things, and that brain reward is 2 to 10 times greater than anything a teenager's ever going to experience in real life, quote unquote real life, whether it's falling in love and that dopamine rush that comes from being in love, or winning a race or playing football. Any of those things provide that reward system, a wonderful rush of the neurotransmitter dopamine and other neurotransmitters. But an opiate gives 2 to 10 times that. And that begins to change the brain. The brain begins to wire itself around that experience. And it focuses in on finding that reward more and more. Now, again, about 90% of the population doesn't really have that mechanical action in their brain, but about 10% do, and these are the folks that are high risk. So I mentioned the psychological part. The biological piece is there a co-occurring disorder? You know from your work that there's a lot of folks with mental health issues that often self-medicate. So if I am, again, the one we probably see most is anxious, anxiety disorders or depressive disorders. If I feel that way, and I put it in this kind of false dopamine thing into my body, all of a sudden the message I'm getting is, I feel great. I'm no longer anxious. I can talk to girls. I can ace my test. I can, fill in the blank. And I can do that. That, again, is a powerful lesson, and the brain begins to wire itself around that lesson. And these neural pathways are built, and we call it wire together, fire together. So when they start to do that, every time I take another pill or take a shot of bourbon or smoke a joint or do an Adderall, anything like that, what I'm doing is reinforcing these these neural pathways and wiring together a really strong connection that's going to change the way my brain perceives reward.
I see. So you mentioned a couple of different types of substances and in relation to addiction.
Yeah.
So are you saying that whether something is an upper or a downer, just for general purposes, it's the addiction aspect that still makes it work the same way, sort of, in your
Yes,
brain?
yeah,
You know what I mean?
that's a good way of putting
Yeah.
it. It does, the mechanism of addiction is very similar, depending on all, not so specific to the drugs, although each drug, kind of stimulates different neurotransmitters
Right,
and things
yeah.
like that. But yes, the mechanical action is pretty much the same. And once I've taken up that mantle, right, the cycle of addiction begins, and it's very hard to escape that. So the things that families see, the behaviors that families see among youth with drug problems, adolescents with drug problems, that is so baffling, the behaviors, the manipulation, the dishonesty, stealing and things like that. If we understand the way addiction works in the brain, and we understand that this frontal piece, by the way, is the number one place that's most muted by addiction, right? So they're at a double kind of disadvantage, because if you and I sat down and had a couple drinks right away, the disinhibiting of the brain would happen, because that's what drinks do, And the same thing happens with teenagers. The problem is the addiction lives down in that pre-evolved part of the brain, the reptilian part of the brain, and it equates my next using of the drug with the same action as breathing or survival. So I'm living on that thing. That's when addiction truly takes hold, not in the early parts, but it can go to that part. So it's important to remember, when we see these behaviors, people are kind of doing their jobs. It's very predictable. Somebody in full-blown addiction, an adolescent in full-blown addiction, their behaviors are predictable. They're scary and abhorrent, but they're fairly predictable.
I see. So that's actually, you brought up a good point, is when does the moderate usage of a substance turn into an addiction? And what you're saying is that there are certain behaviors that are kind of tip-offs to when we've passed to the dark side, let's call it, right? So that's really fascinating. So
Yeah.
as you talked about the family or parents seeing these, difficult or abhorrent behaviors, or I don't understand what's going on
Right.
in my kid's head.
Which is hard to parse out from regular teenage behavior.
Exactly. But that was actually going to be my next question. As a parent,
Yeah.
how do you use your frontal cortex to actually determine the difference? And at what point do you say, I think there's something going on here?
Well, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that, because I think it's really important. First of all, right now I have a 13-year-old at home, and he's a wonderful, smart, creative person, but he's also a 13-year-old, so that he needs to be doing his job, which is to be evasive and grumpy. There's a lot of stuff happening inside him. As a parent, I trust parents. I know when something's going on with my child. So there are signs, I always tell parents to kind of, if they're concerned, first of all, if you're concerned, there's probably something going on, generally. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean to call the doctor and get them into rehab. It just means pay attention, right? And so it's hard to, like I said, hard to parse out the difference, but I want to pay attention to what's going on. I do have good instincts as a parent. So if there's something happening I see, I begin to notice patterns and I'm paying attention. And by the way, it's okay for me to comment on them. You know, I've noticed that you are this way. You want to talk about this. I've noticed this, you know. But it's the place where many families get stuck is they feel like, is this just kind of youthful exploration of substances? Heck, I smoked weed when I was a kid, or I drank when I was a kid, and I didn't get into trouble. And to a point, that's true. We have to be careful about the messages we send to our children, because not discussing it is kind of an implicit endorsement of behavior. So, but there's going to be some exploration. The best kind of thing to do is to talk to the kids early and often about their experience around this stuff, what they're seeing at school, what their friends are doing, how they feel about it, and let them know how you feel about it. So in answering, kind of going around back to answer your question, I think, you know, there's no specific tip-off. You will know if your child starts, you know, acting really oddly or sleeping a lot different. Sleep patterns change, moods become more even dysregulated, money issues become more profound. So those are things to kind of look for. But again, I think instead of, you know, a lot of parents get very nervous and scary. This brings up, you know, a lot of people's red flags, and that's fair. But I try to kind of calm the conversation down a bit and say, begin talking to your children about these things early, right? So then if something does come up and you're acting abnormally, I can say, gosh, I'm concerned about you. What's going on? Do you want to talk? If it goes further than that and it becomes apparent there is a problem, sometimes it's time to call for professional help or talk to your medical provider and try to get a little more help.
I see. What can the school system do, or what can we even do as a community to open up the dialogue and the conversation around this?
I think it's better than it was a few years ago, and unfortunately, because of the opioid crisis, which has been in a lot of people's minds, unfortunately, because of all the deaths associated with that and all the lives impacted. The good part of that, again, is that we're talking about it, and it's becoming normalized, just like a lot of other things have become normalized by being in the news. I think as a community, as a school system, first responders, social supports, things like that, we are each other's eyes and ears. So we have to keep an eye out for each other, and we have to do better in instructing and giving education about drugs. And from a place, I work with a lot of adolescents, and if I'm honest with them and I treat them on a level playing field, we do better in communicating. That's one thing I've learned. So to really talk to kids and not be so afraid of what they're going to tell us in response, I think is a good way to begin. And also do early intervention. There's a lot of research that suggests that if I pinpoint certain co-occurring disorders early in a child's life and get him or her help early on for those things, the rate of addiction comes down in adolescent years. So we have a lot of research and help out there these days, and a lot of more resources than we used to. And I think as we're coming together better with that stuff, and I think that'll continue.
Are there things that we can do at the middle school level, or to kind of prevent some of the predisposing things? Like you talked about anxiety being one of the coinciding things that often come along with some of the problems with addiction?
Well, I think it's a kind of a global question, and our culture, unfortunately doesn't give a huge amount of credence to kind of mindful attention to our wellness, right? So I think one thing Massachusetts is doing and other states are doing is we're talking about substance use earlier in the schools. So that's beginning the conversation. We're being able to recognize, and there's more help available than there ever has been, for co-occurring disorders. And as parents and as a community, I think it's important that we look for this stuff early on and try to get help for people early on. And that doesn't necessarily mean a medical intervention or psychiatry or, somebody like me or whatever. It just means there's plenty of holistic approaches to treating anxiety. Meditation works better than most anything else and things like that. Exercise, these types of things. So incorporating that into our daily lives and also making space for our kids to hear what they're thinking, what their experiences are. I work with a lot of kids in this community, and at first I thought, gosh, these parents are putting a lot of pressure on these kids. And it's not necessarily the case. There's internal pressure that goes on in communities all over the state. And so just giving them kids a forum to talk about that pressure and to, in some ways, figure out ways to maintain their wellness. Teenagers, adolescents are the most resilient humans there are. They're really amazing, and they're always doing more intellectual work and emotional work than we give them credit for. So my experience is if you give them kind of a place to talk about this stuff, they're happy to do that.
That's good. So that's for prevention. If we wanted to look at, and you touched upon the resources that we have, can you get a little bit more specific about that? I know you have your practice in Concord. You also are involved in Right Turn, I believe the name of the center, in Watertown, and then you're involved in NAMI. Can you talk a little bit about those resources?
Yeah, I'm really proud to be on the board of NAMI Central Middlesex, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And the support that's available through NAMI is amazing. So it's often a point of entry for folks that are experiencing this. And it's not just support for the folks that have experienced mental health disorders, it's also for their families and loved ones. So that's a great resource. There's a wonderful resource in our community. Emerson Hospital is here right now. I work with a lot of wonderful clinicians from the community. My own, I do personalized addiction treatment in Concord for adolescents and adults, and I do treatment advising. So if somebody is at the point where they need a kind of a higher level of care, I help navigate that with the family and the loved ones. And if somebody really does need help, and the family is baffled, they can always call me. But there's the substance abuse hotline, the Massachusetts Substance Abuse Hotline. You can Google it. It's a free program that will you make a call and say, this is the insurance I have or don't have. Here's what I'm experiencing. What should I do next? And they can kind of help guide you through that maze of treatment and options and give you some resources to look at.
I see. So if there was one thing that you wanted to, one message that you wanted to give to our audience, what would that be?
I think that it's time to address the fact that addiction is not in the shadows, that everyone in this Commonwealth knows somebody who's been affected by addiction. And if, like many other issues that we've learned to kind of confront and treat that were stigmatized before, if we do that, it's a win-win situation, right? If I'm not afraid to go in and get help for an addiction issue, guess what? My healthcare costs are going to be lower if I get it earlier. I'm a better person in the community. I'm able to help somebody when they need help. It's also important to know that there's a lot of people who suffer because of the stigma. So by destigmatizing it and simply by just talking about what you and I are doing here today, we're helping to destigmatize and normalize addiction. You know, 1 in 10 Americans is affected directly by it, and many of us indirectly. So it's important to kind of get the word out that this isn't going anywhere and that it's not a moral issue. Addiction is a chronic condition that affects the brain and body functioning. And that's science. I didn't just make that up. That's scientific fact. So it's no longer a moral issue. It's time to treat it as a medical issue.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible insight and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
And I think that is a really important message about the destigmatization of addiction and what happens in the brain, and particularly getting people early on, teens, working with teens. So thank you so much for all the work you do and for coming and sharing
Thank you for having
your
me.
input today. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
So there you have it. Thanks again for being our guest in the show, and we really appreciate our expert guest here, Jon Cohan. So hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.